Okay, so I'm going to talk today about cereal rye production, just a little bit in case you aren't familiar with Beersford. We're kind of between Sioux Falls and Sioux City. We're in the southeast corner of the state. The research farm's been there since early 60s, before I was born. And we've been working with rye. I started working with rye there, I think, in 2010, and we've had rye on the farm every year since. So, let me make sure I turn this on. Okay, there we go. So first thing I want to do is recognize my crew. We really wouldn't get anything done without all working together. This Gerald Williamson, he's retired. Since then, we've hired a nice young fellow, Denver Nordman, tall man with a strong back, so we're glad to have him around and always cheerful. Ruth Stevens, she just retired this year. She was the secretary. She held everything together. Brad Rops is the operations manager, keeps everything on schedule. Scott Bird manages the feedlot. Jocelyn Forsett is works with horticulture and is a crop research technician, and Addie's a high school student, now a college student at Dordt. So whatever good things we're doing, the crew was with the crew's help. So just a little bit to think about rye as a background, and we want to think about where it came from, and it's historically, I think, because it helps you to think about how it interacts with wheat. It was first domesticated as a weedy contaminant in wheat. So it grew with wheat, and people lost their wheat crop, and they saw the rye survive, so they selected for it. And it was cultivated in northern Syria about 9,000 years ago, and it shifted to Central and Northern Europe, and the Romans used it in their military posts because it was cheap food. But the take-home message here is the whole reason rye is a crop is because it couldn't be separated from wheat. So it's very difficult to separate rye from wheat, and rye will outcompete wheat. It's tougher, it needs less nitrogen, it's has fewer disease problems, it's more winter hardy. And those are all reasons, as an agronomy guy, and southeast part of the state, we don't raise much wheat. We like rye because it's tough character. But it's very difficult or impossible to get it out of wheat. So for your neighbor's sake, if they're raising seed wheat especially, you have to keep that in mind, because in seed wheat, there's zero tolerance for rye. So the reason I'm bringing this up is if you're going to have rye and wheat close to each other, you really have to think about keeping them separate, and especially if you're in the seed production field. So that needs to be said. Okay, in terms of adaptation, it's very winter hardy. It tolerates acid soils better than wheat. It doesn't like wet feet, and it doesn't like hot temperatures. And we're going to kind of look at the crop from Alan Savory's framework of looking at energy flow, water cycle, nutrient cycle, and community dynamics. So we'll kind of define the crop through those ways, and you kind of get to see its pluses and minuses and benefits. And then at the end of the talk, I'll talk a little bit about rye agronomy. So this is a chart. We're looking at water use on this axis. This is the week of the year on the x-axis. I've got wheat here, but rye would be similar. It'd be over a little bit to the left. And we've got corn and soybeans. And so I kind of want to illustrate this with the energy flow. These small grains are growing and using moisture earlier in the season than your corn or soybeans. So you're taking advantage of energy that's available at this time of year. The other side of it is it leaves you space to grow a cover crop at the end of the year. In terms of water use, the water use going to take off quickly in the spring. And again, rye curve, this is for wheat, so the rye curve would be a little to the left of this. So if we're raising it and we're hoping to double crop it, this becomes a real point of concern because the rye will use quite a bit of moisture early, and that may jeopardize your following crop in a double crop situation. Just to show how quickly rye will grow, this is some data from 2017. We're about 1,300 pounds per acre. On May 16th, 2 weeks later, we're pushing 3,000. So just increased about 2.5-fold in biomass in just a couple weeks. This is some data from 2019. This is from Ben Brockmuller's master's student I had a few years ago. And we're looking at rye growth over time. So this is rye biomass on the y-axis and the date of the burn down on the x-axis. And we can see we don't have a lot of growth till we get into early May, and then it takes off like a rocket. So here it's about 300 pounds, up here it's about 2,400 pounds. So in that 1 month span, we have an 8-fold increase in biomass. Which you're trying to raise forage, this is good, you want a lot of biomass, but it's going to use a lot of water while it's growing this fast. This is some data from Minnesota, and we've got 2 sites, Morris and St. Paul, a little bit east of us, but it's good data. And this black line is soil water under fallow. So the soil water's on this axis, and we've got time on the x-axis. And the red is under a rye cover crop. So we can see we get to early May, there's not a lot of separation. We get into mid-May and late May, and the rye starts using a lot of water. By the time we get out in June, we've lost over 2 inches of water at both sites. And again, if you're in an environment with plenty of water, that's not a problem, might even be an advantage. If you're in an environment where moisture is at a premium, then you really have to think about, do I want to let this grow into May, or do I want to kill it here? And everybody's situation is different, but you just want to be cognizant. It grows really fast in May, and it will use a lot of water. This is some more data from Ben's thesis. These blue bars are rye dry matter, and we've got different dates here, April 19th, 29th, May 13th, May 23rd, May 31st. And then this is the carbon to nitrogen ratio. So now we kind of got to change our thinking here a little bit and start thinking about nutrient flow. So this crop is growing very rapidly in May. It means it's taking up a lot of nutrients. And the other thing is the carbon to nitrogen ratio is going up, which means it's going to break down slower. So if we let it go, we're going to have kind of a double whammy there, or depends what you want to happen, if you want to have the carbon or not. But this rye here is going to be, easily twice as much nutrients in it as if you'd killed it May 13th. But not only that, this has a carbon to nitrogen ratio of about 15. This has a carbon to nitrogen ratio of 25. This is going to take a lot longer to break down. So the longer you let it go, if you're raising it as a cover crop, the more nutrients it's going to take, A, and B, the more resistant it's going to be to decomposition, the more nutrients it's going to hold later into the season. So if you want the nutrients to turn over quickly, you want to kill it when it's short. If you're trying to feed carbon to the soil and you've got plenty of moisture, you want to let it go. But you've got to think about where you want to go with that. Am I in a situation where I want to save water, I want to have I want that rye to break down quickly, then you want to kill it early. You're in a situation where I want carbon to feed the soil, I want heavy mulch. I got plenty of nutrients. I'm not worried about that. I got plenty of moisture. I'm not worried about that. Then you might let it go out here. This is some data again from Ben's thesis. And just as observed nutrient content, this was in a cover crop. We had a little bit less than 1.5 tons of biomass total. And we had about 72 pounds of K2O in there. At a high end, if we were managing this for higher production, it'd be closer to 3 tons per acre, we'd have 168. So that potassium, we get quite a bit tied up in the rye. And that's important, again, because of there's an interaction between potassium and drought stress. So if we let the rye put on a lot of growth, it's going to take up a lot of potassium. It's rich in potassium. It's going to use a lot of moisture. Now if we go into a dry period, we're going to have that mulch on the surface. It's not going to break down. And your crop is especially sensitive to potassium deficiency under drought. So again, you have to think about your potassium levels and whether this is an issue or not. Yeah, Rich.
Will that rye help to make a release or make potassium more available?
I'm coming up to that. Just wait a minute. Okay, so it's a good question, but just in 5 minutes, and you ask me the question again in 10 minutes if I haven't answered it. Okay, so the point I'm trying to make is in this situation, especially if you're cutting this for silage, now you use the water, you cut the rye for silage, you took all that potassium out of the field, and now if you're in a situation with marginal potash, you mined a whole bunch of potash, you mined a bunch of water, and you set your next crop up for a difficult situation. So especially if you're removing it for hay or silage, you really want to think twice about that and whether you got enough potassium in the soil that you can handle that. Okay, and then this is just kind of showing similar things. And again, this is a silage situation, not a cover crop situation. If we look at corn silage, we got just about 10 pounds of potash per ton. With rye silage, we got more like 24 pounds of potash per ton. So the rye is rich in potassium, and if you're taking it off the field, you'll be mining the field. There's another thing here for the ruminant nutritionists, which I'm not one of them, but the rye silage really high in potassium means you're a little more likely to have milk fever problem for dairy cattle. So if you're a dairy cattle person, you just, I'm sure there's ways to manage it, but you want to be aware that if you're using rye silage for dairy cattle, you want to think about the potassium levels and milk fever. Okay, now kind of switch gears a little bit and think of rye as a cover crop. This is from an experiment we had at the Southeast Farm where we split some plots with and without cover crop. And as the cover crop gets sprayed out, then it decomposes. And this kind of goes back to, I think, where Rich was going. If we don't take the moisture, if we don't take the material out of the field, won't it be released? And it will be over time. Depends how moist the year is. In a dry year, it'll last longer. In a wet year, it'll decompose faster. And we did a trial at with some tile drainage plots looking at with and without a rye cover crop for 3 years running. And this graph here shows microbial active carbon in the soil from the Haney test. And this is the year, so we start out in 2018 and it ends up in the fall of 2020. And we can see where we had the rye cover crop, I think there might have been a little sampling error there, we had more microbial active carbon. And if we pool that data and put it together, it's statistically significant. So the rye is benefiting microbial active carbon, so it's benefiting your soil health. And then we took a look at that, and this graph has a lot of numbers on it. I'll just explain it briefly. So we're going to go through 3 years of data, and we've got a control and then a rye cover crop. Control and rye cover crop. And this, look at the potassium and the zinc. So in the potassium, this is the first year, and this was the corn nitrogen or potassium levels in July, and this is the whole crop in September. This isn't a concentration, this is pounds per acre in the plant, right? So we're tending towards having higher potassium content where we had the rye cover crop, and we had significantly more zinc in the corn crop where we had a rye cover crop. Okay, this is the second year of the study. And again, if we look here, we've got 118 versus 97. Here we're at 264 pounds per acre versus 225. This is in the crop. And we've got a statistically significant more potash where in the soybean crop where we had a rye cover crop. And we also have more zinc. In the third year of the study, so each year, this is 3 years running, so we have a cover crop every fall. Again, we're looking at the potassium. We have significantly more potash, 170 versus 154 pounds in the crop in August. And then in September, we're at 195 versus 164. And this is also statistically significant. And we lost our zinc difference there. But there's a trend there, if you follow through the data, for more phosphorus, but particularly strong for potassium. And you think of it, the crop really likes potassium. It's taking up the potassium, concentrating it in the surface, and then when it decomposes, it's releasing it. So we're actually, looks like we're increasing our potassium availability when we leave the residue there. And I think of it this way. I kind of like dry beans, and I like to eat them. They're good. I did some work in graduate school with them, and I've raised them. But this is just the shelf in our grocery store in Beersford. So when those beans are on the grocery store on the shelf in Beersford, I can't get at them when I'm at home. Spatially, they're away from me, and also they're in a can. Structurally, I can't get at it, right? So that's my wife. She gets the beans, and I just put them on the plate to demonstrate it. And those beans are available. So there's no more beans in the town of Beersford from here to here, but the beans that are available to me are increased because somebody went and took them from the grocery store, brought them home, got them out of the can, then they're available for me. Okay? So you kind of see where I'm going here? So you haven't changed how many beans are in the town of Beersford. You just made what was there more available. So what this rye cover crop is doing, it's like the person going down to the grocery store and getting a can of beans and bringing it home and making it available. The rye cover crop sending its roots out. It's got a mycorrhizal network in the soil. It's pulling out potash, and particularly because it likes potash, it pulls out a lot of it. And it's pulling out zinc and phosphorus. And some of that would have been available anyway, but some wouldn't have. Some of it was only going to happen because the rye went out and got it. And it's bringing it all together to the top of the plant. So we're tending to build our nutrient availability over time. So there's only one caveat to that is you have to have moisture for that rye straw to break down. So if you go into a drought, that rye straw will be a nice mulch to keep the soil cool. And if you got what moisture you got, it'll help stay there, but it won't unlock the nutrients till it breaks down. But if we keep going year over year, it should accrue. That's the trend we're seeing. Okay, so we talked about light. So we're picking up energy in the spring and the fall we wouldn't be using otherwise. We talked about moisture. We have to be careful with it in May because it grows faster than you think and it uses more moisture than you think in May. And we've talked about nutrient dynamics. So now we're going to talk about community dynamics. This is from some plots we had, I think in 2011, a while ago, one of the first times we raised rye. And we had a fallow and this was Ryman. I think we were going to hay it because that's what we could get money to do for the grant. But there's a lot of weeds here at this time. We don't have so much pennycress on the farm now, but at that point we did. But if you look over in the rye, I took this picture between the rye rows, there's no weeds there. So night and day difference. Rye is very competitive, and it's got allelopathic properties, so it suppresses weed growth. This is some data that we did on organic block, And we were kind of mean to the plants. We intentionally seeded rapeseed as a model weed, plus we just had the weeds that were out there. So there was a lot of intentional weed pressure in these plots. And we were looking at a number of different lines of wheat and triticale, and we had rye in as a check. And we had 2 years, 2012 and 2013. 2012, as you know, was a dry year. We didn't have that good of a stand on the rye. And still, we're looking at weed biomass. At the end of the season, we had 300 pounds versus 574 in wheat. So it was better than wheat, but nothing did that well because of the drought that year. 2013, we had good moisture. The weed biomass in the wheat doubled, 574 to 1,118. Look what happened in the rye biomass when the rye had moisture. It went to 20. That's almost nothing. It's hard to find 20 pounds per acre. You've got to get down on your hands and knees and pull little seedlings. So when you have a good rye stand and good moisture, you don't have any weeds. That's what we've seen. And usually at the research farm, we don't have to apply any herbicide to rye. And when we have a field that's given us trouble, sometimes we have people that do research and they don't want herbicides used, or they want certain herbicide used because they're looking for an interaction, and the herbicides they choose don't function very well. And so we end up with a mess when they're done with their research. And I usually try to put those fields into winter rye to clean them up because it's just so competitive with weeds. It's outstanding in that regard. And I can only think of one time we had to spray our rye with herbicide. So I wouldn't say it's bulletproof. You're never going to have to spray, but you'll want to scout because most years you won't have to. Yeah.
Are the weeds starting and the rye is killing it out, or is it suppressing germination of the weeds?
Both. It's allelopathic. There's a chemical thing going on there, which is suppressing the weeds. And then also it comes on really strong, fast in the spring. And we'll see that when we look at the forage. It comes on faster and stronger than wheat does. So it just outcompetes whatever's there. So I wouldn't say you'll never have to spray it, but most years if you get a good stand, you don't have to spray it. And the only time we really see weeds is when we have skips, when we have places where something happened and we've got a planter skip. Okay, so the other part of community dynamics, yeah.
Okay, the question is, how thick do you have to, does it make any difference how thick you're planting that rye, how close it's planted?
Yeah, basically what I would say there, Rich, is we plant it as a cover crop. We're using about 35, 40 pounds per acre maybe, if we're trying to save on the seed. Or if we got plenty of seed, we'll go more than that. But if we were trying to suppress weeds, you want to go more like 80 or 90 pounds per acre. Yeah.
Row spacing make a difference?
Row spacing would make a difference too, but we're just planting it with a John Deere no-till drill. And if we've got enough seed, we'll put in a heavier seed rate. But I would say the recommended rate, if you're not worried about weed pressure, would be around 35 or 40. And then what we saw was when Ben's research, we ran about a little over 20 pounds per acre, 22 pounds per acre, and we got about 2/3 of the biomass that we got at 90 pounds per acre. So if you're trying to save money on seed and you just want to have a few plants, you can go with a low seed rate, but you won't get the weed suppression. Okay, so I want to talk about marketing because I think this is really important, and I hope it doesn't become a problem, but I'm afraid it might. So, community dynamics, marketing, we're thinking about how the plants interact, but also how the people interact. And somebody's got to buy the product, right? Somebody's got to be willing to pay for it to make it worth growing. So I pulled out some data. This is 2024 data on rye production. And this are the top 6 states for rye production. South Dakota is number 6. And over the whole country, there's 2.2 million acres. But notice only 400,000 is harvested for grain. Places like Wisconsin, 260,000 acres planted, 30,000 harvested for grain. Oklahoma, 250,000 planted, only 70,000 harvested. So these states are raising a lot of rye for forage and for cover crops. And only about 20%, 18% nationally is raised for grain. So there's a large market there as a forage and as a cover crop. And I think as people get more interested in cover crops and soil health, and I'm not sure where the government programs will go with NRCS support, but I could see this market continuing to increase. The other thing I would point out is South Dakota, on average, we had the highest yields in the country, 56 bushel per acre. And so that makes it a little bit hopeful that we'll have a competitive advantage. I pulled out my old textbook. It's got from when I started college over 40 years ago. And this is from 1969. And each dot there represents 1,000 acres. And you can't see them very well, but there's some scattered in here and a few up there and around there. But notice where the big part of it is. Right there, right where we are. So I'm kind of hopeful we'll have a competitive advantage with this crop if it takes off. And the other thing that has my interest in it is we have hybrid rye developing. They're mostly coming out of Germany. And rye very much likes to cross-pollinate. Wheat doesn't cross-pollinate. Oats don't cross-pollinate. But rye is about 70% outcross. And crops that want to cross-pollinate usually respond to hybridization with a yield bump. And so we've seen, for example, our corn yields in South Dakota go from 30, 40 bushel an acre statewide average in 30s and 40s and 50s. We start to get into hybrid rye in the 60s, and we've been picking up, on average, 2 bushel an acre every year. So we went from 30 to 40, now we're talking 150, 160 for a state average. And I'm hopeful, I think, with this rye that we're just getting started in this. And I think over time, the yield potential on those hybrid lines is going to keep going up, because that's the type of plant rye is. So in that regard, if the yield potential goes up, our cost of production goes down, and if this seed market picks up, there'll be a demand for it. Okay, then this raises the next question: what if we can't sell it? What if there's not a market? So the animal science researchers, Warren Ruschi and Zach Smith, did some work here at our research farm and looked at inclusion rates for rye as a feed grain. So this is like a backup market. If you raise it and you can't sell it, can you feed it? And this is average daily gain, pounds per head per day, and this is days on feed. And this yellow line is 60% rye, and you can see it starts out strong, but it ends up weak. The black line is no rye, so that's the control. And the 40% is kind of in between, but the 20% rye ends up right with the corn. So including rye at 20% of the ration didn't show any loss in productivity in terms of grade or cattle weight. And I just visited a little bit with Warren this morning to be sure I could say that. And he said, yeah, no, that's true. We're doing some follow-up work. He said the trend is actually if you have a little bit of rye in the ration at 20%, you might do a little better than corn with the younger ones. You should, but it won't hurt you at all for sure. It might help with when the cattle are young. So this is a backup market. Provided people are aware of it and willing to use it, it should at least have the value of corn. Okay, so we talked about the hybrid rye, kind of in the big picture sense. Now we're going to talk about agronomy with it. So, Cody, how much time do I have? Almost half an hour, okay. So we got plenty of time then. Okay, so now we're going to talk more about agronomy and try to get at the nuts and bolts of raising it a little more. So as a cover crop, our production has gone from about 3/4 of a ton to 2 tons, or usually around a ton to 1.5 tons. If we manage it for high forage production, means we use a high seed rate, plant it early, and fertilize it, then we can push closer to 3 tons an acre dry weight. And it depends on fall planting date, moisture, and when we take it out. Later burn downs, we kind of talked about before, means more biomass, and also the biomass is going to break down slower, more nutrients taken up by the rye, and more water use. This is from some forage plots run at the farm. So we've got a winter wheat, forage wheat, winter triticale, and rye. This is April 1st, and you can see how the rye is greened up a lot faster than the triticale and the wheat. And especially when you have a hard winter, there's a lot of separation between rye and triticale and wheat. When you have a real mild winter, the triticale will kind of keep up with the rye. But when the winter's hard, the rye is all by itself in terms of coming out of winter dormancy and putting on rapid growth in the spring. And we've run a number of these trials. Brad's harvested them. And I'm just going to quickly point out this line here. Hazlitt's an open pollinated line, and it's consistently in among the higher yielding materials. So this is 2021, Hazlitt's there, is the number 3 numerically, and it's statistically the same as the top yielding one. This is 2022, it's the second, it's statistically the same. And I could show you more data, but it's pretty similar. And here again, the Hazlitt is, in this case, this is from Mountain Wagner with Norm Uherka. The Hazlitt was the number 1 line. So what I'm trying to get at here is that for forage production, your better open pollinated lines will keep up with the hybrid lines. Your hybrid lines cost about twice as much for seed. But if you're raising it for forage and you're looking for tonnage, your better open pollinated lines will get you there. And the one line that's been consistently a good performer is Hazlitt. Second thing we want to mention with cutting it for forage is that the quality goes down very rapidly after it heads out. So we want to cut it in boot stage. And this is some data from Wisconsin, days after boot stage, relative forage quality. And it goes down very quickly. So rye doesn't have the quality that wheat does or winter triticale. And then when that goes past boot stage, it goes down in a hurry. So if you want forage, you don't want to let it go past the boot stage. The second point is if you're raising it for forage, then what about the next crop? So this is some data from 2017, and this is different soybean varieties following rye. And I don't want to dwell on them too much, but we got 60 bushel an acre. This was a year with good moisture following a rye silage crop. And this was similar to what we got as our farm average. So we really didn't see any yield loss on the soybeans in 2017 following a rye silage crop because we had plenty of moisture. Okay, this is in 2021. We had a drought. It was very hot and dry in June. We took the rye silage off, and the soybeans really struggled, and the corn that we planted after it really struggled. So we had soybeans, late corn, and early corn, 96-day, and a forage sorghum planted after rye silage. In this case, the soybeans got 29 bushel an acre. Our nearby checks got 63 bushel an acre. The early corn, 96-day, did 73 bushel an acre, and the nearby check did 158. So that 2.5 inches of moisture that the rye used in May really hurt really created a lot of stress here in this drier year. And the forage sorghum handled it better. Okay, this is another example of a dry year. This is 2022. We had a severe drought, and we took the rye off for silage. Forage sorghum went 13 tons per acre. Our corn silage only went 8 tons per acre. It was a situation with the terminal drought, so the longer the season went, the more stress developed. So our early beans got about 20 bushel an acre, where the farm average is about 30. So we got about 2/3 of a soybean with the early line. With the late line, it wasn't even worth combining, really. Well, my pointer's not pointing. Let's see if this advances. Yeah, that advances. Okay. So the point I want to get with this is the double cropping thing can really work well if you have good moisture. We've done it a number of times, and we planted, taken the rye off for hay or silage, planted soybeans into it, and if we have good moisture, it works great. Of course, you can always overdo something, but we're talking about cutting the rye the last week of May, and we're getting beans in, the first week of June anyway. When you go into a situation where you're in a drought, you might only get half a soybean crop or less. So if there's no moisture, that double crop thing becomes a high risk deal. So you kind of have to think about where you're at and your likelihood of running into severe drought stress. If you're in Minnesota and you're in a place with a lot of moisture and you've got good soil with good water holding capacity, that may be a low risk venture for you. If you're from somewhere where it's lower rainfall and maybe you're on coarser textured soils, that becomes a high risk venture. So double cropping can work, but it really depends on the soil moisture is what I want to say. Okay, so what about grazing rye? These are some cows in the spring on rye, on corn stubble. And we looked at the soybean yield following that. Anyway, the fall and spring graze, if you look at that first column, was 60.1 bushel per acre. And what was just spring grazed was 59. What was ungrazed was 56. So we didn't see any, statistically, you can't separate those. They all did the same. So the grazing didn't hurt us. And the trend is actually for a little better yield where we grazed it. This is an example of rye raised for grain. We had a good fall. In 2021, we got the rye established in good order. Our December biomass was about 1,500 pounds per acre. Brad fenced this off. We put we put out check plots, so we'd have grazed and ungrazed. I took measurements in December. They had 360 pounds per acre of rye biomass where it was grazed and 1,500 where it wasn't grazed. So the cows got about 1,200 pounds per acre of rye that they grazed out of that. And so Brad had them graze it hard. Then we come back the next year, and the same place, we got ungrazed and grazed, and basically we got the same yield. And we've done that a couple times. We did it once, probably about 12 years ago with Hazlitt, and this was about 3 years ago, where we grazed it hard in the fall. And we didn't see any effect on the grain yield in the following year. So rye will tolerate grazing in the fall. It's what our data suggests. You don't always have the opportunity to do that because some years you have a dry fall and the rye really doesn't get established and put much growth on. But in those years where you do get a good catch, you get it planted earlier and you get good moisture, then the fall grazing in late November, early December looks like it would be an option. And so there's a few decision points here in thinking about, rye for forage. Are you managing it for high forage production or just as a cover crop? So that's the decisions you'd be making in August, September, and determines your planting date, your seed rate, and your fertilizer use. In late April, if it looks like we're short of moisture, you want to decide, do you want to keep it or do you want to spray it out? If your next crop is really valuable to you and the rye is not that valuable as a cover crop and you're short of moisture, you probably want to spray it out. And then your third decision point with this rye forage deal is in late May, you've cut the rye if you're taking it off for silage. Now you have to decide, am I going to try to plant a forage sorghum or going to plant a soybean? And we've managed to get decent stands of forage sorghum following rye. I think maybe some people have had problems with it, but it's worked for us anyway. So those are your decision points there. The big ones, late April, and again, it's a judgment call, but if you don't have reserve soil moisture and the forecast looks dry, then you really want to think twice about keeping the rye around. If you got plenty of moisture, the forecast looks good, then you can keep it, and if you're planting beans, you can plant right into it green and spray them out. And then in May, if you cut it for silage, do you want to follow with soybeans? Or if it looks ugly in terms of drought, forage sorghum is a lot tougher. Okay, so now we're going to kind of switch towards variety trial work with grain rye. And this table shows the years 2019 to 2024. I've got the hybrid average and the open pollinated average, and then the difference. And I plotted the average of the hybrids versus the average of the open pollinated, and I put in the table the best hybrids versus the best open pollinated. And I guess I draw your attention to the lower line. Our average was 79 bushel per acre on the hybrids over 6 years. In the variety trials, 55 for the open pollinated, so the advantage about 24 bushel an acre. Looking at the best lines, our average yield was 89 bushel per acre of the hybrids, 62 for the best open pollinated lines, so a difference of about 27 bushels per acre. So for grain production, it looks like the hybrids show a return on investment, the better hybrid lines. Thinking about planting date, this is unreplicated data. We had 4 different fields for various reasons got planted at different times in 2021. And you can see the September 23rd ones yielded about 80 bushel per acre. The ones that were planted October 8th yielded about 65, and the ones planted November 4th yielded around 46 bushel an acre. So later planting, we dropped our yield potential on the rye. This is going to depend a lot on the year, because this was going into 2022, which was a severe drought. So it wasn't very forgiving for late planting. Right? If 2022 had been a wet, cool year, your late planting might not have mattered so much. But when you're going into a severe drought and you plant late, the crop's going to mature later, and it's going to mature further into the drought.
About 5 minutes left, and we'll take questions for 5 minutes.
Okay, all right. So the point here is, if we're planting it, I guess what I'm trying to say is the hybrid lines look like, in terms of grain production, we're getting about 24 bushel an acre on average, better yield with them. And probably want to keep your planting date in late September if you can. This is a nitrogen yield response curves from Clear Lake and from Beersford. And we just, in terms of applied nitrogen, both of these are going on soybean stubble. The average optimum rate of applied nitrogen would have been about 0.8 pounds per bushel. So if we're shooting for 110 bushel then we want to put 88 bushels of nitrogen down, is what that would mean. And this is kind of a work in progress. We'll keep repeating this, so over the years, the number might shift a bit as we get more information, but this is the best we've got right now. And I need to talk a little bit about ergot. Ergot is a fungal disease. The spores can infect brome grass. They can infect smooth brome. There's a number of grasses ergot can get into. It infects the head right when the pollination is going on, and it ends up replacing the seed with a fungal body. So that's what my pointer's not working, but that's what this little black deal is here. It's an ergot sclerotia. And the problem with ergot sclerotia is it has a lot of toxins in it. So it's a vasoconstrictor. It constricts blood vessels, and it can cause miscarriages. So it's not something you want to have, but rye is more susceptible to it than wheat or other grains. And it's particularly spreads when you have uneven heading, because it can get into the first plants that head, and it'll quickly sporulate from there. So if you've got kind of a staggered maturity, you've got a mixture of varieties, so they're not all coming out and heading at the same time, you'll be more susceptible to having ergot. If you've got something where everything heads out all at once, it's only got one shot and it can't really spread from one to the next, and you'll be less likely to have ergot. Another factor with the ergot is if you can mow your ditches so that you don't have brome in there that's heading out, that it may have ergot sclerosias in it that are spreading too. So ergot is favored by uneven stands and wet, cool weather at heading, and also copper deficiency. And varieties differ, so the hybrid lines tend to have lower ergot levels than the open pollinated lines, I think primarily because they're genetically uniform, and so they all head at once. There's no effective fungicide treatments, so your management is rotation, use less susceptible lines, have clean seed so you blow the ergot out, uniform stands, so everything's coming, if you have an ununiform stand, that's going to cause some to head out later than others, and that causes trouble, and control volunteer grasses. Also, we've seen ergot tends to be a little bit worse along the edge of the field, so that's something to look for, and you might want to combine that separately if it's an issue. It can be cleaned out with color sorting, and my information is with gravity separation. So in terms of hybrid rye agronomy, you want to avoid wheat. Planting dates, mid to late September. Seed rate, 800,000 seeds per acre, plant about an inch deep. Right now we're looking at about 0.8 of a pound nitrogen applied per bushel of yield that you expect. Weed control, bronates labeled for rye, where you don't need to use it most often, but if you have particularly weedy field, maybe with a lot of winter annuals like pennycress, or you have in a weak stand, you might want to use an herbicide. Bronate's labeled. Tilt is labeled as a fungicide if you have wet conditions. And basically, we usually don't use a fungicide, but if it's very wet, you've got two things. You have high yield potential and high disease pressure, so it's likely a fungicide will pay. So under high moisture conditions, we do use a fungicide. So the pluses in terms of rye, it's very competitive with weeds, has moderate fertility requirements. It's more resistant than wheat to head scab and wheat streak mosaic virus. Has very vigorous spring growth, which gives it potential for forage. Like any small grain, the planting and harvest is offset from corn and soybeans, so you can spread your labor out. It can provide straw, and also a place to put manure. You have an opportunity for grazing. In our situation, we plant the rye in the fall. If we're set up for it and everything works right, we can graze it that fall, but that you can't really count on that. Then we take the rye off for grain. We can plant a cover crop, and include winter rye in the cover crop mix. We can graze that in the fall. And then we can graze that again in the spring, what overwinters the next year, and plant going to soybeans. So basically, that's the system we're going towards on the Southeast farm, is working with hybrid rye with the intention to graze a cover crop after it and promote volunteers, and then graze those again the next year in the spring and plant soybeans. It adds diversity, improves soil health and structure, and is tolerant of acid soils. The minuses are the market uncertainty. So we don't, at this point, have an established feed market for it. So we have to think twice about selling it. It's contaminant for wheat. The older OP lines are prone to lodge. It doesn't like poor drainage or wet conditions. Ergot is an issue, and so you don't want to get back-to-back rye crops, or even have a cereal, another small grain ahead of rye, is not advisable. Water is an issue when you're double cropping. I kind of went through that the rye will use moisture your next crop may need. Leaf rust can be an issue. It hasn't been for us yet. And we had hot, dry weather in June 2023 really hurt our yields. It does have one advantage too, is that if it doesn't overwinter, you can evaluate the field at the end of April and make a decision, and if you don't have a good stand, you can spray it out and you still have opportunity to plant corn. And whatever fertilizer you put down is not wasted. So that's it. So I'll try and take questions.
You got a couple?
We got a couple minutes for questions for Dr. Sexton.
Yeah.
Do you want to elaborate a little more on potassium release and availability?
Well, we just have this one data set at this point, Rich, but the trend is there that we're seeing more potassium where we have the cereal rye, and I think it's just concentrating it on the surface and making it available.
Is it affecting the potassium in the soil, or is it lowering the potassium levels by making it more available, or are the soil levels staying the same but you have potassium available?
I think it's taking potassium that's not available and making it available, and then it depends what you do if you export that from the field or not. So if you cut it for silage, you're going to take it away.
But if you leave it,
If you leave it, you left it there and it's still there, and it'll be more available down the road.
Can you talk how to mitigate the risks with no-tilling forage sorghum after a forage rye harvest?
I guess what we would is
Or what would be the best recipe for success?
what would be the best recipe for success? Well, if you can find a way to kill the rye right away, that would help you. You'd have to look and see what your herbicides are labeled. I think glyphosate is labeled for grain sorghum. I don't know that it's labeled for forage sorghum. So if you can spray it, like in our case, if you can spray it quickly, it'll knock it out, and then that just gives it more time to, if there's any allelopathic things there, to dissipate. And then I would say, if your soil temperatures are cool, wait a little while, because the rye will come off last week of May. Sometimes the soil will be a little cool yet, even for the forage sorghum. So you might want to wait a week or two, 10 days to plant. And that's what I guess I would say. If you plant a dual-purpose sorghum, I don't know where that puts you on the label-wise, because it's a grain sorghum, but then you could use glyphosate, and then there's nothing on the label that says you can't cut that for silage.
Have you had any issues with autotoxicity?
We haven't seen it. I haven't seen it. I've talked to people that said they did. So all I can say is we haven't seen it.
Let's hear a round of applause for Dr. Sexton.